Your mother died this morning? In the highlands of Papua New Guinea about 70 years ago, that means a decision has to be made about her body, and it is not the decision you are expecting. You are not going to bury her. Burying her means putting someone you love into cold, wet ground and walking away while she rots. It means handing her to the worms and the maggots. To the people you are standing with, that is not respect. That is abandonment. That is throwing her away. So the women of the family gather, and they take her apart, and they eat her. I need you to sit with that for a second, because your instinct right now is horror, and their instinct was the exact opposite. This was tenderness. This was the most loving thing they knew how to do. You take the person you cannot bear to lose, and instead of giving her to the dirt, you keep her. She goes inside the bodies of the people who loved her most. She stays in the family. She is not gone. She is carried. They were not monsters, and they were not starving. This was a funeral. And over the next 50 years, it is going to kill about 2,700 people, and it is going to take the women first. At its worst, in the worst villages, more than 2% of everyone alive was dying of this every single year. Some villages ended up with almost no young women left in them at all. One survey counted 125 grown men in a single place, and 63 of them had no wife because she was already dead. And nobody is going to understand why. Here is the detail that decides who lives and who dies, and it is so small that it took outsiders decades to even notice it mattered. They did not all eat the same thing. In the south, where Kuru hit hardest, the men had mostly stepped back from it altogether. Once a boy was initiated around 10 years old, he moved into the men's house and left the practice behind him. It became a thing women did. And there was one rule that turns out to matter more than any other. No male over about 6 years old ever ate the brain. Not once. Not ever. The women ate the brain. Women of every age, and they shared it with the small children who were still at their side. Babies under 3 were given nothing, but the ones between about 3 and 6 got indulged, the way you slip a child something off your own plate. Nobody was forcing anybody. A child ate what a child was handed at the funeral of somebody they loved in a crowd of adults doing the same thing. Now, at the time, this was just how the body got divided. Custom. The way your family has a particular way of doing Christmas. But we know something they did not, and it is this. Whatever was killing these people was concentrated in the brain. Of every part of a human body you could possibly choose to eat, the brain is the single most dangerous one by an enormous margin. So the custom was not neutral. The custom was aiming. The men, who ate the muscle or nothing, mostly lived. The women and the children, who were handed the brain, mostly did not. It never started dramatically. That is part of what made it so hard to see. It began as a wobble. A woman would be walking and her balance would go slightly wrong, the way it does when you stand up too fast. She would put a foot down, and it would land somewhere she had not planned. Then it became a tremor. Her hands would shake, then her arms, then her whole trunk, and it got worse when she was cold or upset, and it did not get better when she rested. Her own people had a word for it. Kuru. It means to shake, to tremble. Within months, she could not walk without someone holding her. Then she could not sit up. Then she could not swallow properly. And somewhere in that decline, something else would start happening, and it is the part the newspapers grabbed onto. She would begin to laugh, not because anything was funny. She would burst into laughter she had not chosen and could not stop. They called it the laughing death. That name is half true, which is the worst kind of true, because what is actually happening is not joy. The part of her brain that decides what her face should be doing is coming apart. Doctors call it emotional lability. The feeling and the expression stop matching. So, a woman who is terrified and dying and completely aware of both will laugh, and she cannot stop. She is not laughing herself to death. She is dying, and her face has stopped taking orders. Then she would die. About a year from the first stumble, sometimes 2, and there was no treatment because nobody had the faintest idea what it was. By the 1950s, outsiders had arrived, and the numbers stopped them cold. In some Fore villages, women were dying so much faster than men that the balance of the population visibly broke. Villages full of men and children with almost no adult women left in them. Thousands of people died of this. So doctors came, and they did the obvious thing. They went looking for a germ. They found nothing, no bacteria, no virus they could isolate, no parasite, no fungus, no fever, no swelling, none of the signs a body shows when it is fighting something, because the body never fights. Her immune system checks the thing that is killing her, finds that it is made of her, and walks away. It does not make a single antibody. It does not send a single white blood cell. If you took blood from a dying woman and looked at it, it looked like the blood of a healthy person. So they tried the other obvious answer, genetics. an inherited condition running through families because it clearly clustered in families, but it did not behave like a gene either. It tracked something else. It followed who attended which funerals. And when the practice began to stop in the late 1950s and into the 60s, new cases in children began to stop with it, which is not something a gene does. Then the answer arrived from somewhere nobody was looking: a sheep vet. In 1959, an American veterinary pathologist called William Hadlow was walking through a medical exhibition in London, and he stopped in front of a display about Kuru. Hadlow did not work on people. He worked on Scrapie, a disease of sheep, and the photographs of ruined human brains in front of him looked exactly like the sheep brains on his own desk back in Montana. Scrapie was known to be transmissible. It just took years to show up. So Hadlow wrote a letter to a medical journal suggesting somebody try giving Kuru to a primate and then wait a very long time. So a team at the American Health Institutes, led by a doctor named Carlton Gajdusek, did exactly that. Michael Alpers, the physician living among the Fore, performed the autopsies and got the tissue out. One of the people he autopsied was an 11-year-old girl called Kagea, who he knew well, and who took 6 weeks to die. Her brain went into a chimpanzee. They had agreed to watch those animals for 10 years before they would call it a failure. They did not need 10 years. 21 months in, one of the chimpanzees stopped playing. Then it began to shake. Then it died of a disease from a village on the other side of the world. So it was transmissible. Something was moving from a dead brain into a living one. But there was still no germ to find because the thing doing it was not alive. What was in that tissue is called a prion, and it is one of the strangest things in biology. It is not a virus. It is not a bacterium. It has no DNA and no RNA. It does not eat. It does not breathe. It has no genes to copy. It cannot do any of the things we normally use to decide whether something counts as alive. A prion is just a protein that is folded into the wrong shape. Your body is full of proteins, and a protein only works if it is folded correctly, the way a key only works if it is cut correctly. A prion is a protein folded wrong, and its one and only property, the entire thing it does, is that when it touches a correctly folded protein of the same kind, it makes that one fold wrong too. That is it. That is the whole disease, a shape that turns other shapes into copies of itself. 1 becomes 2. 2 become 4. They stack up into clumps, and the clumps break apart, and every broken piece starts converting again. And it keeps going, silently, for years, inside a brain that feels completely normal until so much of the tissue has been converted that the brain physically starts to break down. Under a microscope, it ends up full of holes, like a sponge. And because it was never alive, you cannot kill it. Bleach does not touch it. Alcohol does not touch it. Boiling does not touch it. The hospital autoclave, the machine whose entire job is to kill everything on a surgical instrument, runs its cycle, and the prion comes out the other side still infectious. To actually destroy it, you need lye, or you need fire. You cannot starve it or poison it because it is not doing anything that can be interrupted. It is just a shape. Gajdusek shared the Nobel Prize in 1976 for showing the disease could be transmitted. And I'm going to tell you the rest of that because it matters. 2 decades later, he pleaded guilty to child abuse. The victim was a teenage boy he had brought to America from the Pacific Islands, one of dozens of children he had moved into his own home over the years. He served about a year, then left the country and never came back. The science held up. The man did not. Stanley Prusiner won a Nobel in 1997 for working out what the thing actually was. And for a while, a lot of scientists thought he was wrong because an infection with no genetic material sounded impossible. Now, the cruelest part, and it is the reason this went on so long, the gap between eating and dying was enormous, on average somewhere between 10 and 13 years. But in some cases, it stretched far longer than that, past 40 years, past 50. Think about what that does to a person's ability to work out what is happening. A child eats at her grandmother's funeral at 6 years old. She grows up, she marries, she has her own children. And at 35, decades after the meal, she starts to stumble. There is no possible way, without modern science, to connect a funeral in your childhood to your own body failing in middle age. The cause was so far away from the effect that it was invisible. The Fore stopped the practice around the late 1950s and the 1960s, and people kept dying of Kuru for decades afterwards because the disease was already in them, quietly folding, waiting. The last person died of it in 2009. Roughly half a century after the practice that gave it to them had stopped. And here's what their dead bought the rest of us. A Kuru is the reason we even have a word for this. It was the first time anyone proved that a human brain disease could be caught, that you could eat something and rot from the inside out 20 years later. That gave science a category and a warning. So when British cows started staggering in the 1980s and young people started dying in the 90s, the category was already sitting there waiting. More than 4 million cattle were destroyed. 178 people in Britain died anyway. And there is one more thing. When surgeons open a brain and the patient turns out to have a prion disease, those instruments never touch another human being again. Not because anyone is squeamish, because nothing in that hospital can clean them. Alcohol does not work. Formaldehyde does not work. Some of it actually makes things worse and welds the protein onto the steel. A group of grieving families in the Highlands taught the world all of that. So the last thing I want to leave you with is this. Strip away the part that horrifies you and look at what is underneath it, because it is not foreign at all. They could not stand the idea of putting someone they loved in the ground and walking away. They wanted to keep them close. They wanted them inside the family rather than under it. You have felt that. Every person who has ever kept a jar of ashes on a shelf or worn a ring that belonged to someone dead has felt exactly that. They just had a different way of doing it. And the way they portioned out that love, men to the muscle, women and children to the brain, is the reason it was the mothers and the children who paid for it.